Alternatively, you can genetically engineer or edit the cells. So doing targeted reconstruction of certain genes that can allow you to acquire this immortalized phenotype. I know these words sound scary, but in reality, it's actually not that complex. And basically, that allows you to do a very targeted way of producing immortalized cells, so you don't have to go back and biopsy the animals. However, in certain regulatory jurisdictions, which we'll talk about, that can be a longer pathway to regulatory approval. And so companies generally try to avoid that. And then finally, you can also take what are called primary cells. So those are basically taking a biopsies directly from the animal and throwing that into your production process. And that, therefore, you're basically using cells that haven't been grown in culture for a long time. They haven't adapted to cell culture, but they're just being basically thrown right into the process. And then you'd have to go back and biopsy the animal. And so some of the companies that are doing that actually envision that, hey, let's not eliminate what animal agriculture is for a lot of people. Let's have smaller herds of animals that we can go back and biopsy and have them live basically a normal life until completion, but continue to have those animals and not necessarily disrupt the sort of livelihood or tradition of existing farmers. And I'll just say for farmers, since there's a question that comes up, it's like, where do they fit in? So if you're a farmer making crops, we're still going to need crops because these cells need to consume feed. And that feed can come from commodity crops like soy and glucose that comes from corn or sugar beet or sugarcane. And so there's a lot of opportunities for farmers to play a role in the supply chain from a feed perspective. Those same raw materials can also be used to feed microbes for what we call precision fermentation, which is another technology to make animal proteins without the animal, as well as for plant-based meat. And so I think there will be opportunities to not only rely on these commodity crops that exist today, but also diversify the types of crops that we produce in the future and create something that is less monoculture and more diverse in terms of the needs of different products that might be created in the future. If you are an animal farmer, so if you're raising hundreds of thousands of chickens in barns or pigs and that sort of thing, there's not as much opportunity for you in this new paradigm of production. That's what I'll say. There's people that are thinking about, can we bring the equipment onto farms and sort of retrofit farms into these new production systems? I'm a little bit skeptical of that, but people are trying to imagine that future.
Thank you for sharing that information. I want to connect the dots between these two conversations on a few different levels and also acknowledge, as I try to do in every conversation, that part of this asking of questions is to make sure that people from all perspectives, all food choices are having an opportunity to learn about cultivated meat and think about this from their own vantage point. As someone who was chatting with Dr. Langford from a animal science, animal welfare, ethics lens, I would say a few things that you mentioned certainly stand out in terms of the question around animals and then also the broader conversation that we had around reducing meat choices as part of what's advocated in terms of the anticipated demand, the many factors that you have mentioned that we anticipate by 2050 and beyond, in terms of the current state of animal agriculture, in terms of supporting our own health and well-being. So to connect these dots a little bit, I'd say the first thing you mentioned is that there is a smaller number of animals involved when we think about those that would be involved in actually taking cells from the animal as compared to the number of animals living in these systems today. And that's not the only factor. As we talked about with Dr. Langford, we want to think about the individual animal's experience. However, if we think about, say, a utilitarian ethical framework, we are trying to think about the positives and negatives and how those map for all involved. And so we can at least say there's fewer animals involved, even if there's some discomfort or problems involved in the state of cell removal today. And there's room for possible improvement on that, for instance, from animals that are no longer living as opposed to animals that are living. We're still talking about a far smaller number of animals because of the way that those cells can be used over time. We're also talking about a very different lived experience in the sense that we're taking the lived experience out of the process once those cells have been taken, because we're growing animal products, we're growing parts of animals, we're growing, essentially, as you mentioned, the equivalent of parts that will be developed into things like what we see as a chicken nugget or other completed products, as well as particular organs or parts of the animal without the animal living in the conditions that might be living in today in a broader system. When we think about the broader conversation for the planet, for human health, for any number of different benefits that we've already talked about here, one of the key takeaways that we know is advocated and that we're continuing to see more and more research supporting is to, particularly in the US, but certainly more broadly as well, to reduce the amount of animal products consumed on a daily and weekly basis. And so to your point about farmers, we're seeing a shift for many farmers in terms of diversifying crops, bringing in a variety of different plants for human consumption, not just the crops that are being developed for animal consumption. And that I anticipate, at least based on these conversations, that is not going away, certainly, and will only continue to be advocated and supported, given that we know many people are being advised to reduce animal products as part of their day-to-day food choices, irrespective of our conversation on the state of cultivated meat. So this is certainly a conversation that is inclusive of farmers, and I think there's a tremendous opportunity there when we think about the broader challenges, 2050 and beyond, and the opportunities. And cultivated meat is an important part of that equation. Plant-based foods are also an important part of that equation. As you mentioned, plant-based meat is certainly a part of that equation as you connected to farmers in your comments just now. And I just want to reiterate that we're talking about a technology and area of innovation that still needs time to develop, as you mentioned. So we also have to be thinking about what the state of the problem is today, what our opportunities are as consumers, as manufacturers, as people looking out for the planet and animals in all of these different lenses, and thinking about these comprehensively. So I see these conversations as integrally linked, and I want to make sure I'm saying these things out loud for those that are listening, saying, I know Erin's a vegan, like how does all this fit together? It's, for me, I see cultivated meat as a win for animals, as a win for the planet, as a win for human health, and certainly manufacturing and efficiency and plenty of other benefits. It's going to take time. And we're going to talk about where things are and where things are going. And we have additional ways to empower ourselves with the choices we're making every day while it continues to take time. So I want to just bring those pieces together for anyone that's in any way thinking, I have some questions about how this conversation and this conversation fit together. I see them as integrally linked. And I think if I were to summarize your points just now with a little bit of a more broad sweeping statement, it's to say, yeah, this is a little different. It's a lot different than the way that animals are being raised today. That's not to say that farmers aren't part of this equation. This is a process that involves tremendous opportunity. It's going to take time. And there are a variety of areas of focus that need attention in the meantime. And I would say in terms of the conversation with Dr. Langford, certainly that involves the way animals are cared for and raised today in farming systems as well. Is that anything that you want to add or clarify there?
Yeah, it's always important to, I think, you frame the context of where all of these technologies are in different timelines. That includes, any alternative protein products that people are working on developing. But I think, like, we compare alternative proteins a lot to renewable energy and electric vehicles because they basically slot into our existing behavior as humans, what we're doing today and consuming and how we're living our lives, without having to make a huge behavioral change. And therefore, you're doing good without necessarily realizing it. But I think a lot of people look at something like electric vehicles and just say, okay, this just drives us further into the need for cars and building infrastructure around cars and all of this sort of stuff. But these are not like single bullet solutions. Like you shouldn't ever look at anything like cultivated meat or any of these new technologies as like the end all be all. You need to basically develop electric vehicles while at the same time advocating for cities that are more walkable and that are more dense, and for public transit and for trains and all of these sorts of things together. And so similarly in the food system, I think a good envision of the future is not one where Americans are consuming 120 kilos of meat per year, whether it's cultivated meat or normal meat. I think you want to together reach a world where there's less meat consumption overall, and you're moving toward a more plant-based diet that we know is more sustainable overall, and that we know can have numerous different, benefits, whether it's on human health or on environmental health for the planet, and obviously for animals as well. So I think all of these things should be, viewed as things that are operating together in a sort of complex shift over time. And certainly cultivated meat is producing hundreds of millions of metric tons of cultivated meat is certainly not going to happen overnight. And so we definitely need to be working on other things along the way, especially given the time frame that we have.
Great. Thank you for sharing that additional context. Let's switch gears to cultivated seafood, which we know is an important area of focus for the Good Food Institute and presents a lot of opportunities, as we've been already talking about from a cultivated meat perspective, for industry, for academia, and for consumers. How does alternative seafood reduce health risks and improve efficiency, as well as provide benefits to production and the supply chain? And why does this matter when we're thinking about marine ecosystems, sustainability, and more?
Yeah, so just like commercial animal ag is really bad in a lot of ways, commercial fishing is in some ways even worse. I think if you're a consumer looking at cultivated seafood, some of the things you might care about is the potential that you have no heavy metal contamination. So mercury, for instance, no microplastics or reduced microplastics. Again, some of the data here is forthcoming, but this is what we expect. Reduced foodborne illness, as I mentioned before. This is a common thing with seafood, is a lot of people can get sick from eating seafood because it can spoil easily. And that is much more controllable for cultivated meat or seafood. I think another thing that people care about is supply chain traceability, and basically a lot of seafood that might be getting at a restaurant. Sometimes it might not even be what you think it is. It's a very opaque, complex supply chain. There's illegal fishing and bycatch all the time on the open oceans because there's not much oversight. There's also slavery at sea, and that's been documented by commercial fishing operations and that sort of thing. Obviously, from a worker standpoint, it's a lot better. You don't have to be out on a boat, potentially literally as a slave, working on these boats. And you can have full traceability throughout the supply chain and really know what you're consuming. So I think those are all a lot of potential positives when it comes to cultivated seafood. Obviously, there's sort of wild catch fishing and also aquaculture, which has become quite predominant method of seafood production over the last few decades. But that has its own animal welfare issues that you're using a lot of antibiotics in those processes. You have disease, anything where you're basically crowding animals into an enclosed environment. You welcome disease, you welcome the use of antibiotics and animal welfare issues. And so all those things can be, again, mitigated and completely avoided really with switching to a cultivated meat production system. I think importantly, seafood is interesting because there's so many species that we eat. And so there's fewer cultivated seafood companies. And then they have to figure out, like, what should I be working on? What species can I focus on? Because there's so many to choose from. And what do we need the most? So I think companies have different philosophies on this. Some people might look at something like tuna and say, these animals you can't farm them because they're basically apex predators in the ocean. We basically have to catch all of them from the wild. And so by doing so, we can decimate their populations pretty easily. So we might want to focus on tuna. Others, for salmon, similar reasons. Maybe that's aquaculture and wild catch there. And then others are looking at species that are endangered, eel and things like this in Asia that's consumed in high quantities now, but also you can't harm them. And so there's a lot of different focus areas for cultivated seafood companies. But what is true across all of them is that the research is really early and it's more challenging. And there's not enough information out there in the existing scientific literature where you can just go and understand how to go and culture like tilapia cells. There's a lot of pre-existing knowledge on human cell culture, mouse cell culture, et cetera, that is fairly adaptable when you switch to like a cow or pig or chicken. But once you start moving further down the evolutionary ladder into seafood and crustaceans and things like that, invertebrates, it becomes a lot more challenging. And yeah, you mentioned GFI. We focused a lot on seafood explicitly because it's underserved. And so there's a lot of counterfactual impact that can be had by focusing on seafood, because we really need to basically elevate the foundation of where we're at today in terms of our understanding of just basic culture conditions for how to get these cells growing so that we can get everyone on a higher level of a starting point and we can see success more rapidly. And so there's a lot more basic research to do in the seafood realm than in the conventional animal ag realm, or animals that are used in conventional animal ag on land, let's say. And so, yeah, it's been a focus, but also a challenge for researchers for sure.
I know you've talked previously in terms of some of the materials available on your website about the important role that databases play, both for regulators and transparency for safety, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but also in terms of some of the challenges from a research perspective. Can you talk a little bit about the current data gaps that you're seeing and how these apply both to seafood and meat? What role does open access research play in all of this? And then how do universities and academic researchers stand to both benefit and contribute from sharing of data?
Yeah, so this is partially why GFI exists. So in the cultivated meat world, a lot of private capital was raised. There was a lot of excitement and hype over, oh, we can create meat from cells. Like this is potentially revolutionary. A lot of people wanted to get in and a lot of money was poured into that. But what ends up happening, which is predictable, is that you have a lot of private companies working in silos where they're essentially all doing the same type of research, but none of it's being published out in the open. So there's very little, there's gains within companies, but there's not gains within the whole community of researchers. And so we have been advocating for a long time for increased public funding into cultivated meat and other alternative protein technologies. So the same level of support that governments played for renewable energy development or reduction in cost in different technologies like solar panels in the early days or batteries, you need that same level of support to get these alternative protein technologies to where they need to be. And so we basically skipped over this sort of foundational, bedrock of information that you would otherwise have when you try to commercialize an industry and scale it up. And so cultivated meat in the public sphere is really playing catch up. I'm on the advisory board of the Tufts Industry Consortium. I've been on the external advisory board at research at UC Davis, which are two of the basically most largest nucleus of researchers working on cultivated meat in the United States. And we see a lot of research globally as well, since we've been funding research for 5 years or so now. And I think generally speaking, the academic research is probably 5 or 6 years behind companies because they've had a lot of resources and scientists working on this for the interim time. So just a lot more money, a huge imbalance, basically, where we have to get more money pouring into the public sector, get more scientists working on these problems, get more scientists trained to go into the workforce as well, which is an important area that will become more of a bottleneck over time, we think. And so obviously all these things need to happen together as the industry becomes no longer nascent, but into something that's really producing product at any reasonable scale. You mentioned databases and lack of information, that sort of thing. And so I think there's a couple of key areas. This is basically the job of what we think about is what are the biggest bottlenecks or challenges? What are the biggest opportunities as well for new businesses to be formed? I think there's a couple of different segments of information gaps that exist today. One is that there's still not a lot of information on the end products themselves. And what is the nutritional profile? Does it have the same digestibility and bioavailability as conventional meat? How different is it from conventional meat? What sort of variants can we expect? So that's where something like these sorts of databases have been produced for other food categories. And that could really help just increase the amount of general knowledge that we have about these end products that a lot of people want to know. Now, some of this information is going to inevitably trickle out anyway, because at least in the United States, as products get approved, there's a whole hundreds of pages of information that gets approved, that gets released along with it, that has information on amino acid profiles and lipid profiles and micronutrient and all this sort of information that people want to know. But certainly it can be streamlined and happen much faster with the help of public researchers pouring that information into databases and things like that. So I think there's still a big opportunity there. And then there's data gaps and information gaps all along different places of the value chain. As we mentioned before, seafood is way far behind. And so just basic culture conditions for how to grow seafood cultures or crustacean cultures, there's very little information on that now. We just were in a meeting the other day with the seafood community that we curate a little bit at GFI and have people meet each other and get in the same room and talk about their problems. And I think we talked about the need for sharing negative results. So what doesn't work? As I mentioned, all these companies are working in their own sort of silos, and they're testing a lot of things, and a lot of those things don't end up working, but none of that goes out into the public either. So people just end up repeating the same mistakes over and over again. So there's a need for can we put a database together that just has negative results in it so people don't spin the wheels on things that we know don't work? And then just a lot of things that can be done. But not enough time in the day for me or my colleagues, at least, to handle all of it. And so certainly we need governments to play an important role supporting larger research endeavors at universities. And some of this is starting to happen already, especially in Europe and in Asia. The US is a little bit behind, but still has begun to fund projects at some sort of scale, like in the millions of dollars. But yeah, overall, still very far behind of where we need to be.
The point you made about sharing what doesn't work or didn't work, I want to make sure I've repeated, because I think we know this is a challenge in the broader research environment. What gets published tends to favor experiments that worked and what we learned from those, and the need to create channels to create the ability to share what didn't work. And what we learned from those has been highlighted for a long time, whether we're thinking about publications, whether we're thinking about the way we share wins versus challenges in work environments. Like, we need to encourage sharing of learning, including things that didn't pan out the way we expected them to pan out. So really appreciate you sharing that. And definitely appreciate the role that you're playing in terms of bringing researchers together, certainly collaborating with industry and helping to bridge these gaps in light of the known data gaps and in helping to create pathways for that greater knowledge sharing, for sure. I'd love to delve into an example or two just to help our listeners better understand some of this work from a storytelling perspective. You mentioned Tufts University already and their collaboration, as well as Moat Marine Laboratory, are two that really resonated with me from your website. Can you walk us through some examples in terms of the challenges that researchers have been facing when it comes to limited existing cell lines, and some ways that you're working in these types of collaborations and more to help address these challenges?
Yeah, I'd love to. So GFI, we're a nonprofit organization. We're funded entirely by philanthropy, and we're lucky because there's a couple of donors that have put forth significant funds that allow us to have a research grant program. And so that started about 5 years ago. And our research grant program is really intended to be catalytic, basically injecting funds into important research areas that will hopefully lead to more funds following on. Because right now there's just not a lot of opportunities. And you mentioned cell lines. Basically, the starting point for any research endeavor begins with the cells, and it begins with how to culture them. And as we mentioned before, it's really just not the case that there's a lot of existing cell lines from farmed animals or for animals from fish and crustaceans, etc. And basically, a lot of the projects that we've funded over the years are heavily skewed toward establishing this basic foundation of cell lines and cell culture conditions, like cell culture media formulations and everything. And yeah, Moat Marine is one of the groups that we've funded, which is a group in Florida. And they are working on establishing some of the first crustacean cell lines that will exist, essentially. So that's an important foundation of knowledge of what it takes to actually grow, let's say, shrimp cells outside of the shrimp body, which there's really not that much information on. Similarly, Tufts University, they really got started early on. They had some funding from New Harvest, which is another nonprofit that funds research in cellular agriculture. And so some of the first PhD students worked at a lab there in David Kaplan's lab. And that just brought a lot of momentum into the university. They've received a $10 million grant from USDA to establish a National Institute of Cellular Agriculture, which is the largest grant awarded to cultivated meat research to date in the United States. And they also have an industry consortium that GFI is a part of that involves 5 other companies that essentially fund research. And it's a good example of public-private collaboration where the research that is basically voted on is guided by the industry and the people that are having hands-on problems with challenges in the industry. And so you get that feedback to get the research a little bit more targeted and translatable into the challenges that are being solved, being presented as you begin to scale up these sorts of processes. So I think those are 2 examples, but right now there's a lot of other examples. What we found in another important project that we work on our science and technology team is called our Alternative Protein Student Project. And so we have student chapters at universities all around the world, over 50 of them now. And what we found is that students, especially the younger generation, they tend to care a lot more about sustainability, and they tend to care a lot more about animal welfare. And so they see these technologies like cultivated meat as a huge opportunity for them from a career perspective. And so they'll go to the labs that they're working in and say, like, why aren't we working on this? And basically what ends up happening is that the students convince the principal investigators in those labs to start research in those areas. And we're expanding that program. We have applications open now to welcome and onboard even more student chapters. We're now, I think, in all 6 continents aside from Antarctica. So there's a lot of momentum in the academic world in terms of just getting people interested in the actually really exciting research challenges that this presents. Because this is not an easy endeavor to basically say we're going to replace meat production with cells that are grown in tanks. It's very challenging from a scientific and engineering perspective, but as a scientist, that makes it a lot of fun. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for young scientists to get involved and to really basically carve out their careers in this area, which is basically something that I did 6 years ago as well.
It's fantastic to hear that students are helping to drive that process and convince principal investigators to take on this research. And I love that there are open opportunities. So we'll make sure that we include the links to that. And want to acknowledge a couple of examples I mentioned with Tufts and Moat Marine Laboratory certainly resonate with me as a supporter of both of those organizations. But as you mentioned, there are many examples of the work that you're doing. Are there any other collaborations or case studies that really resonate deeply with you that you'd want to share?
Oh, so we have on our website a list of all the projects that we've funded if people are interested. We also have a funding database for people that are looking for opportunities. I think out of our grant program, I think what's interesting is because we have so much control over the projects that we fund, we tend to fund things that are what you call translatable science.